think most of you know Michael Burlingame is one of the premier Lincoln scholars that the country has, and it's really remarkable that we have him here tonight. He spent his career, aside from writing about Lincoln, spent his career teaching history at Connecticut College, retiring in 2001. As he told me, retiring perhaps earlier than he might have, so that he could get this done in time for the bicentennial. He is currently co-chair of the Connecticut Abraham Lincoln Bicentennial Commission and serves on the board of directors of the Abraham Lincoln Association and the Abraham Lincoln Institute. He is also a member of the board of advisors of the Abraham Lincoln Study Center at Knox College. Professor Burlingame devotes his scholarly energies to investigating the life and times of Lincoln, about whom he has published 12 books. His most recent work, published in 2008 in time for the bicentennial, is the 2-volume set, Abraham Lincoln, A Life.
Be sure to buy it. You don't have to read it, but be sure to buy it, okay?
Doris Kearns Goodwin, who's also been to Hildene a couple of times, noted that Lincoln scholars have waited anxiously for this book for decades. Its triumphant publication proves it was well worth the wait. Few scholars have written with greater insight about the psychology of Lincoln. No one in recent history has uncovered more fresh sources than Michael Burlingame. This profound and masterful portrait will be read and studied for years to come. I have in front of me, if I were to continue, a list and description of all the other books that Professor Burlingame has written. That the read would be impossible. They're written, but I'm going to skip that and give you Professor Burlingame. Thank you.
Well.
Nice to, and we'll do the drawing afterwards.
Well, thank you very much for that kind introduction, Seth. It's an honor to be here. This is my second trip to Hildene. I came here many years ago when I was first starting out my Lincoln studies and have very fond memories of it. This book is simply called Abraham Lincoln, A Life. It's a somewhat vanilla title, I must say. I have a good title for my next book. My next book is a memoir of my experiences as a Lincoln scholar, dating back to my freshman year in college, actually. And I'm calling it Lincoln's Slave. I'm told it will have a big sale among the daughters of the Confederacy. You all are New Englanders mostly, I assume, and so you might get the significance of what some people are starting to call this, the Green Monster. Those of you who've been to Fenway Park are familiar with that term. I thought I'd talk a little bit about what justifies such an enterprise, considering that there are 14,000 plus books published already about Lincoln. But before I get into that formal presentation, I thought I might tell you a little bit about how I became a Lincoln scholar in the first place. It was partly because I was born and raised in Washington, D.C. That was just slightly after the unfortunate event at Ford's Theater. I don't mean to joke about my age. I'm 67, but I prefer to think of it as 19 Celsius. Feel free to use that. I stole it from Tom Lehrer. And so Ford's Theater, the Lincoln Memorial, the Capitol, the White House, picnics at Manassas were all part of my childhood landscape. And I think that predisposed me to be a Lincoln scholar. Another thing that predisposed me, I think, was the fact that I have an ancestor, somewhat distant, named Anson Burlingame, who was Abraham Lincoln's minister to China. He had been a Massachusetts anti-slavery congressman and then served as an American diplomat. Another reason I became a Lincoln scholar is because I had a charismatic and influential teacher when I was a freshman at college, and that was David Herbert Donald, a very eminent Civil War and Lincoln scholar in his own right. And as a freshman, I was taken under his wing, made his research assistant, and when he left Princeton to go to Johns Hopkins, I followed him and did my work, graduate work as well as undergraduate work under his aegis. And if he had been a medievalist, I would probably be writing about the Middle Ages today. But the main reason I think I became a Lincoln scholar is because of an event that occurred between my junior and senior years at college. That summer, I had a job as a manuscript processor at the Library of Congress, Manuscript Division, taking original documents that had been contributed to the library and integrating them into other collections. And the fellow who had gotten me that job was the chairman of the history department at Princeton. And he also spent his summers at the Library of Congress working on a magisterial history of European economic development. And every day at noon, he would swing by the manuscript division where I was working, and he would invite me to join him and his fellow historians for lunch. And it was a very heady experience for a callow youth of 20, as I then was, to lunch regularly with eminent historians, leading scholars of European and American history. And one day, about a dozen of us were sitting around the table at the Library of Congress cafeteria, and one of the scholars started to talk about Douglas Southall Freeman. That name ring a bell with anybody here? Okay, yes. Douglas Southall Freeman wrote a 4-volume biography of Robert E. Lee, a 3-volume study of Lee's lieutenants. And at the end of his life, he was writing a multi-volume biography of George Washington. And the fellow who was describing Freeman said, "Strange thing about the author, as each volume of the Washington biography appeared, you could detect changes in Freeman. He began to adopt Washington's gestures and his mannerisms, and began to talk like Washington, using 18th century locutions. And by the end, he even began to look like George Washington." Well, I straightened up my bow tie. I remember this day very vividly. I straightened up my bow tie and said, when I graduate from college, I'm going on to study the Civil War and Reconstruction in a PhD program, and people have told me that I look like Abraham Lincoln. At which point, the chairman banged his fist on the table, causing all the knives and forks and spoons to leap up into the air and come clattering back down to the green formica-clad tabletop, causing a racket that induced every head in the Library of Congress cafeteria to turn around to see what the noise was. And my chairman announced in a voice that could have been heard in Baltimore if the door had been open. He said, "Holy mackerel, Mike, you're ugly, but you're not that ugly." And ever since that day, I think I knew I was fated to be a Lincoln Scholar. One of the great benefits and joys of being a Lincoln Scholar is that Lincoln had a great sense of humor, and he told excellent jokes. He was a world-class punster, and great stories were told about him. And when you do research on Lincoln, you can't help but run into funny stories. And one day I was in the New York Public Library in the main reading room, which as usual was packed. There were people in front of me, to my sides, behind me, everywhere. The whole room was filled. And I was going through a series of reminiscences of people who had known Lincoln, talking about Lincoln. And about a half hour into my work, I encountered a funny story. And without bothering to think where I was, I burst out laughing. And everybody around me went, "Shh, shh, shh." I said, "Oh, excuse me, forgive me, sorry." So I went back and read some more, and lo and behold, after another half hour or so, I encounter yet another funny story. And once again, without thinking where I was, I burst out laughing. And everybody a little more emphatically now goes, "Shh, shh, shh." I said, "Oh, I'm so sorry, forgive me." Well, it happened a third time, at which point the woman sitting across from me, a woman of roughly my vintage, and very earnest, no makeup, wire-rimmed glasses, hair in a tight bun, taking notes from a big sociology book. She leaned across the table, just right across from me. She leaned across the table and she fixed me with her gaze and she said, "Just what is your field anyhow? I think I'm going to switch to it." It's a little reminiscent of that scene in the movie where when Harry met Sally. And I'll have what she's having, right? And I found some funny stories that Lincoln told that nobody else has, that I've never seen print, and that are pretty good. And Lincoln was famous for telling off-color stories. But when he died, his friends refused to share them with the people who were collecting evidence about Lincoln's life, because they didn't want to besmirch his memory. He said they said he told really sometimes pretty raunchy off-color stories, but we won't tell you those. Well, I was doing some research a few years back to the University of Illinois in Champaign-Urbana, in a huge Sandberg papers collection, and I found a reference indicating that he had discovered a treasure trove of these stories. And so I ransacked the Sandberg papers at the University of Illinois for all kinds of things, and found some useful material for my book. But I didn't find those stories, so I was a little disappointed. But then a few years later, I was doing some research at the Newberry Library in Chicago in a little Sandberg collection, and there they were. I thought, oh, this is great. And I've put them in this book. Now, Sandberg was a man of taste, and so he didn't use them, but I have no taste, so they're all in there. But I haven't concentrated them in the one spot. They're sprinkled throughout, so you have to read the whole thing. And I thought there's one that isn't too risque that I thought I might share with you. Lincoln liked to tell a joke about a fellow out in Illinois in his day who was fascinated by the Revolutionary War era. And he learned that a woman in a nearby town had a dress dating back to that period. And so he went and visited the village, looked the woman up, and asked her if it was in fact true that she had a dress of that vintage. And she said, well, yes, I do. And so the fellow says, well, do you think I could see that dress? She's an old lady now. She says, sure, why not? And so she gets it out of a bureau, and he says, do you think I could hold that dress? She says, well, if you want to, okay. So he takes the dress, and he holds it up, and he goes into a rapture. And he says, oh, miraculous garment, dating from the time when this old lady was in the first blush of her womanhood, when she first received you, she must have done to you what I'm about to do to you, namely, kiss you. Mwah! And the old lady looks at him as though he's some kind of nut, which is perfectly understandable. And she scratches her head and strokes her chin, and she says, what? Why, stranger, I reckon if you want to kiss something antique, you ought to kiss my ass. It's 16 years older than that dress. Oh, me. Well, enough levity. Let's get down to business here. A question that's doubtless on your mind, has certainly been on the minds of lots of people I've spoken with, is what justifies a big new 2,000-page book about Abraham Lincoln when there are already 14 or 15,000 books already written? What can there possibly be new to say? And I must say that when I began my first book, which appeared 15 years ago, it was called The Inner World of Abraham Lincoln. It's a series of psychological essays about his relations with his parents and his relations with his children and his relations with his wife and that sort of thing. A book that I wanted to call Shrinkin' Lincoln, but my publisher wouldn't let me. When I started work on that book, I assumed that everything important that Lincoln had ever said, that had ever been said about him, commentary about his personality, his presidency, his political career, had already long since been unearthed by an army of writers and had been published either in book form or article form. And therefore, it wasn't necessary to go traipsing all around the country to dig in manuscript collections and public archives and the like. So I wrote the book, the first draft, based on articles and books that I was able to obtain at the library at Connecticut College. By the way, Connecticut College is not to be confused with the University of Connecticut. It's a small liberal arts school that used to be called Connecticut College for Women. And it went co-ed 40 years ago and changed its name just to plain old Connecticut College. But the female undergraduates, I'm told on reliable authority, refer to it informally as Connecticut College for Women and Boys. I'm not vouching for the accuracy of that description, just that it is so called. In any event, after I drafted the book, I thought I really should at least make a gesture at looking at some unpublished original sources. So I went to Brown University, which is about an hour away from New London, where I was teaching. And in the very first hour of the very first day that I was there at Brown, I discovered a tremendous cache of new information in unpublished interviews that had been conducted by one of Lincoln's secretaries, John G. Nicolay here, with people who had known Lincoln well. This was 10 years after the assassination. And I knew the published literature pretty well, and there was all kinds of information in these interviews which doesn't show up anywhere in the published literature. I was astounded. And so I published those interviews as my second book, called An Oral History of Abraham Lincoln. And I asked the people at Brown, I said, I can't believe it. how is it that such important information as is contained here has gone unused? You've done a magnificent job, you librarians, in cataloging and indexing and describing these documents. And there was, in the card catalog, some of you are old enough to remember what a card catalog is, right? In the card catalog, there was a series of these 3x5 cards describing these interviews, and I was just dumbfounded. And so they told me, well, Abraham Lincoln was a dead white male. It's not very fashionable now to write about dead white males. If you want to get ahead in the history profession, you write about social history, about history from the bottom up. And you write on topics like, well, homosexuality among 19th century Chinese pirates. I'm not making this up. Or cultural hegemony and the corset panic of 1921. Again, that was a paper given at the Organization of American Historians Convention. And I said, well, so be it. And I said, I went ahead and published that. And then I thought, and these were interviews that had been conducted by Nicolay to be used in his big 10-volume biography of Lincoln that he wrote with his assistant personal secretary in the White House, John Hay. But they decided not to use these interviews because they had, thanks to Robert Todd Lincoln, they had exclusive access to the papers of Abraham Lincoln. And historians generally, and quite wisely, understandably, want to write history from contemporary documents rather than from reminiscences of people writing 10, 20, 30 years after the event. Because memory does play tricks on people, and as Mark Twain once said, the older I get, the more vividly I remember things that never happened. So they decided not to use these reminiscences. But reminiscences, if you use them carefully in conjunction with contemporary documents, are very valuable. So I said, I bet you some other early biographers went out and interviewed people who knew Lincoln, and then in their field notes, in their research notes, there's probably a lot of information that didn't make it into their books. Because publishers are always telling you, reduce your book, shorten it, compact the snowball. My publisher made me condense mine to 2,000 pages. It was a hard thing to do. And so I went out to Allegheny College in Meadville, Pennsylvania. I spent a month in Meadville one week, and it's a pretty dreary little town. And found all kinds of tremendous new information about Lincoln in the Iditz Harbell papers. Now, she achieved fame as a muckraking journalist exposing Standard Oil Company and other corporations and their misdeeds. But she had also written a 2-volume biography of Lincoln that had appeared at the turn of the century. And she had a research assistant in Springfield and another one in Indiana, and she did a lot of interviewing herself. And some of that material shows up in her book, and a lot of it doesn't show up in her book. And it was fascinating material. And so I asked the librarian, I can't believe it. There's all kinds of good material in these papers, and they've never been used that I'm aware of. And she said, well, I've been here 30 years, and you're the first person to look at them for more than a day. So if you're willing to go out and dig and to go into unpublished sources, go out on the road and stay in towns like Meadville, you can find a great deal of new information, which I've incorporated into these volumes. And it's not just interview material. There are all kinds of things in addition to letters and diaries, that in addition to interviews, including letters, diaries, speeches, reminiscences, unpublished reminiscences and the like, that are extremely valuable. Let me give you an example. One day I was working at the Brown University Library, and one of the librarians, and they're extremely helpful there, came and said, you might want to look at the scrapbook that John Hay kept of his own personal writings. John Hay was a compulsive writer, and a very good one. And he would contribute poems and articles and various contributions to newspapers and magazines, sometimes signed, sometimes not. And he would clip them out of the journal in which it appeared and then paste it into this scrapbook, and then he would identify the name of the periodical in which it appeared and the date in his own handwriting. And most of the material was post-Civil War, so it wasn't of much interest to me. But toward the very end, I found 2 pages of Civil War clippings pasted by Hay into the scrapbook of his own personal writings. And there was a poem, and there was an article about him, and a lecture he gave, and so on and so forth. And way down in the right-hand lower corner, there was a letter clipped out of the text of a letter, signed Abraham Lincoln, clipped out of a newspaper and pasted by John Hay into his own scrapbook of his own writings. And it was the famous letter to the widow Bixby. And I knew that there was a controversy about whether Abraham Lincoln actually wrote that letter or whether John Hay wrote it and he just signed it. But it wasn't particularly relevant to my research at the time, but I thought, well, what the heck, this is an interesting new piece of information. Why would Hay clip it out of the newspaper and paste it into a scrapbook of his own writings if he didn't write it? And so I did a little research on that subject and discovered that Hay told 6 people that he had written it and that Lincoln had signed it. Now, he told people that toward the end of his life, and he urged them not to reveal that datum until he himself had passed away. So there's half a dozen people saying, Hay told us that Lincoln signed the letter, but I wrote it. And then I did a stylistic analysis, because when I read the letter, which is a very beautiful letter, it didn't sound exactly like Lincoln. And it goes like this. I have been shown in the files of the War Department a statement of the Adjutant General of Massachusetts that you are the mother of 5 sons who have died gloriously on the field of battle. I feel how weak and fruitless must be any words of mine which should attempt to beguile you of a grief so overwhelming. Of a loss so overwhelming. I pray that our Heavenly Father may assuage the anguish of your bereavement and leave you only the cherished memory of the loved and lost and the solemn pride that must be yours to have laid so costly a sacrifice upon the altar of freedom. Well, there's no doubt it's a beautiful letter. And many people have argued that Lincoln's literary reputation rests on 3 pillars: the second inaugural address, the Gettysburg Address, and the letter to the widow Bixby. But the letter it's a beautiful letter to be sure, but it didn't sound like Lincoln's rhythms, it didn't sound like Lincoln's vocabulary. I was particularly struck by 2 words. Were there any words in that struck you as a little funny? Beguile, assuage, right? Those 2 words, beguile and assuage. And luckily, by the time that this was called to my attention, there were databases of Lincoln's writings that could be searched instantly. So I just type in the word beguile, hit enter, and see if it ever appeared in any of Lincoln's published writings. No, except the Bixby letter. And I type in assuage, and once again, never shows up. So I thought, well, that's interesting. Then there's no such database for John Hay's works. So I had to read everything Hay wrote, and which was fine, because he was a good writer. So I read his published work, and I read all of his letters that I could get my hands on at Brown. And you find beguile everywhere. It's a stylistic fingerprint. I found an article that he wrote about a friend of Lincoln's who got killed in the war, in which he uses the word beguile twice in one article in the Civil War. And then another article that he wrote during the Civil War period where, again, the word beguile appears twice. And then there were dozens of other examples I found. The same thing with assuage, not quite as frequently, but still fairly frequently. And then even, I cannot refrain from tendering to you the thanks that can be found in the republic they died to save. I cannot refrain from tendering you. Lincoln uses that once. I cannot refrain from. Hay uses it all the time. So I thought, that seems pretty persuasive to me. And then I looked at the circumstances surrounding the letter. It was late November 1864. It was an extremely busy time at the White House. Hay writes a letter to a banquet organizer in New York saying the president wanted to write a letter for you to read at your banquet. And he wanted to do it himself, but things are so busy here now, he just didn't have time to do it. So he sends his apologies. So Lincoln was clearly very busy. And he gets a letter from the governor of Massachusetts saying, one of my constituents has lost 5 sons in the war, would you write her a letter? So what would a busy man like Lincoln, who doesn't know this widow, what would he do? He would say, John, take care of this widow, because Hay was a very fine writer. And we know Hay told William Herndon, Lincoln's law partner, shortly after the assassination, I used to write letters on Lincoln's behalf all the time, which makes sense. That's what secretaries do. So put all these things together and concluded that John Hay had written the Bixby letter and Lincoln had signed it. And some people have said, well, if you make that argument, you're besmirching Lincoln. I said, look, nobody who wrote the second inaugural, the Gettysburg Address, the farewell to Springfield, and other documents has to worry about his literary reputation being eclipsed. What this should do is increase our respect for John Hay rather than decrease our respect for Abraham Lincoln. Now, by the way, another aspect of the Bixby letter, which is something that had been pointed out by scholars before my time, is that it was based on a false premise. The widow Bixby had lost 2 sons in the war and was trying to cheat the government out of money by claiming she had lost 5 sons. And one of those 3 that had survived actually served in the Confederacy. She also was a rather disreputable character. She ran a whorehouse in Boston. She had been born and raised in Richmond, Virginia. She didn't like Lincoln or the Union cause. She apparently tore up the letter when she received it, according to her grandchildren. And the manuscript of this has never turned up. There have been forgeries that you'll see these at the Lincoln Memorial and Lincoln Museum in Springfield, replicas, lithographs of original Lincoln documents, and you'll see the Bixby letter, but it's a lithograph of a forgery. And the reason it survives is because the letter was sent from the White House to the Adjutant General of Massachusetts. He then took the letter and hand-delivered it to the widow Bixby, and then he took copies to the Boston Advertiser, the Boston Herald, the Boston Post, and the like, and then they published it, and it got published by many other newspapers throughout the country. So that's one example of a manuscript collection where you get insight into Lincoln that otherwise couldn't be obtained. But one of the most dramatic discoveries I made in manuscripts was in the Frederick Douglass papers at the Library of Congress. Frederick Douglass famously, in 1876, 11 years after Lincoln's assassination, declared that Abraham Lincoln was preeminently the white man's president, and we black people were only his stepchildren. And everybody who writes about Lincoln and race quotes that speech. Lincoln was preeminently the white man's president. Well, I'm going through the Frederick Douglass papers at the Library of Congress and find some handwritten speeches in Douglass's own handwriting, including one delivered on June 1st, 1865, 6 weeks after Lincoln's assassination, in which Douglass says, Abraham Lincoln was emphatically the black man's president, the first to recognize his rights as a man and a citizen. By inviting me to the White House, as he did on 2 occasions, to consult on public affairs, he was saying to the country, I am the president of the black people as well as the white people, and I mean to respect their rights as men and citizens. And I thought, heavens, this is going to startling. Emphatically the black man's president versus preeminently the white man's president. And I said, how could I have missed this? Because I had gone through the big 5-volume edition of Frederick Douglass's speeches that the Yale University Press had published a few years earlier. And I don't remember seeing that speech. I certainly would have remembered that. So I wrote to the people at Yale who had edited these 5 fat volumes, and mine are magisterial, by the way. Those are fat. So I wrote to the people at Yale and said, why did you omit this terrific speech, which was given at Cooper Union in New York City, which was the premier spot to give a public speech in those days. So I wrote to the editors at Yale and received no response. So I phoned them and left a message. No return call. Well, those of us who went to Princeton aren't surprised that Yale would conduct its affairs this way, but what can I tell you? And actually, in fairness to Yale, they've got a new person in that position who's a very fine scholar, who's doing a new biography of Douglass. They've established the Gilder Lehrman Center for the Study of Slavery, Abolition, and Resistance. So they're making up for their misdeeds of earlier years. So I found another speech in the Frederick Douglass papers that Frederick Douglass gave later in 1865, a few months after the assassination. And this too was a remarkable speech. And in this, Frederick Douglass says, when Lincoln gave his last speech, that was on April 11th, 1865, which of course he didn't know was going to be his last speech, I and my fellow abolitionists were disappointed, even though he did call for black voting rights. But he called for black voting rights on a limited scale. He said that he believed that black people should be allowed to vote, and this was particularly in Louisiana, but Louisiana was going to be the model for the Reconstruction program that would be carried out in the other 10 Confederate states as they applied for readmission to the Union. And Frederick Douglass says, we were disappointed in the limited scope of that proposal, but we should have recognized that that was a profoundly important speech. We underestimated its significance because we should have known that Abraham Lincoln learned his statesmanship in the school of rail splitting. And to split a rail, that is a log, you take a wedge and you insert the thin edge of the wedge into the log. Having done so, you then take a maul and drive home the thick edge of the wedge. And we should have known that once Lincoln had decided to put the thin edge of the wedge into the log, you could count on him to drive home the thick edge of the wedge. It was a brilliant metaphor and very apt. And Douglass could have cited the way Lincoln dealt with slavery. He starts off in 1861 on a modest scale, drafting a bill in his own hand for the Delaware state legislature to pass, which would abolish slavery in Delaware. Delaware was a loyal slave state. There were 4 slave states that stayed loyal to the Union: Delaware, Maryland, Kentucky, and Missouri. And of those, Delaware had by far the smallest slave population, both in terms of absolute numbers and in proportion to the white population. So Lincoln thought that if you could get the Delaware state legislature to abolish slavery, that might encourage Maryland and then Missouri and then Kentucky to do the same. So he was active behind the scenes, actually drafting a bill himself, getting in touch with Delaware congressman, the Delaware congressman, getting him to work with Delaware slave owners and Delaware legislators. And it came close to passing the Delaware legislature, but it failed. So that's 1861, the thin edge of the wedge. Then in 1862, early in the year, he proposes to Congress in an important public address, he proposes that Congress appropriate money to give to all 4 border slave states, Delaware, Maryland, Kentucky, and Missouri, money to compensate slaveholders if the state decides to emancipate its slaves. And the border states refuse Lincoln. He appeals to them 3 times. You have to take advantage of this offer because the mere friction and abrasion of the war itself is going to lead to the destruction of slavery, and you might as well get something. And we're giving you market value for your slaves. And if you continue to resist this proposal, you're going to lose everything. Well, they were short-sighted and they refused to heed his advice. Then, so Lincoln then issues the Emancipation Proclamation, or he announces, this is on my tie, by the way, with a little breakfast too, I see. In September, he announces that he's going to issue an Emancipation Proclamation, but that was limited in scope too. It would only apply to that area of the Confederacy still in resistance. That areas, it wouldn't apply to the 4 border slave states because they were loyal to the Union, and it wouldn't apply to areas in Virginia and Louisiana that had already been pacified. And then in January 1st, and then he offers the slaveholders 100 days. If you give up the war, you can keep your slaves, showing that he was bending over backwards to be accommodating. He didn't expect them to avail themselves of that offer. But anyway, on January 1st, they haven't. He issues the Emancipation Proclamation. And that's limited in scope. It's pretty broad, but it's still limited. It doesn't cover all slaves. And then in 1864, he supports the 13th Amendment very vigorously. The 13th Amendment abolished slavery everywhere in the United States. Delaware, Maryland, Kentucky, Missouri, Virginia, Louisiana, everywhere. So he starts off with the thin edge of the wedge in 1861, and by 1864 you've got the thick edge of the wedge in the 13th Amendment and intermediate steps in between. And Douglass goes on in that speech to praise Lincoln's sensibility about slavery and the injustice of slavery. And he cites a passage from the second inaugural address that Lincoln delivered on March 4th, 1865. And when we think of the second inaugural, we almost always think of the final paragraph, with malice toward none, with charity for all, and so on. But Douglass said the most remarkable paragraph is the one immediately preceding that, in which Lincoln quotes from Jesus. And Lincoln starts off by saying, the Almighty has his own purposes. And then he quotes from Jesus according to the Gospel of St. Matthew. Woe unto the world because of offenses. For it must needs be that offenses come. But woe unto that man by whom the offense cometh. And then Lincoln says, if we shall suppose that American slavery is one of those offenses which, in the providence of God, must needs come, and that he now wills to remove it, and he gives to both North and South this terrible war as the woe unto them by whom the offense came, shall we discern therein any departure from those divine attributes which believers in a living God have always ascribed to him? Fondly do we hope, fervently do we pray, that this mighty scourge of war may speedily pass away. But if God wills that it continue until all the wealth piled by the bondman's 250 years of unrequited toil shall be sunk, and until every drop of blood drawn with the lash shall be paid by another drawn with a sword, as was said 3,000 years ago, so still it must be said, the ways of the Lord are righteous and just altogether. Well, this is a remarkable speech. He's saying basically, the Civil War is God's punishment on white people for having enslaved black people. And the war will go on and on and on. And this was a question that was on Lincoln's mind throughout the war. Why is the war so bloody? Why has it gone on so long? Lincoln, like most people, believed that the war would be short. But it went on and on and on. And 620,000 men died in the Civil War. That's as many men as who died in all the other wars in American history added together up through Korea. If you take all the American men who died in the Revolutionary War, the War of 1812, the Mexican War, the Spanish-American War, World War I, World War II, and Korea, it comes to the same number. So it was on a much smaller population base than the 20th century. So there's a huge bloodletting. And Lincoln says, I don't understand why God allowed the war to begin in the first place. And this is in a little memorandum he wrote to himself, a very eloquent. Lincoln sometimes, to clarify his thinking, would write out statements, not to be included in speeches, but just to help him with his thought processes. And in this memorandum, he said, in effect, I don't understand why God allowed the war to begin. I don't understand why he allows it to go on and on. I don't understand why so many people are getting killed. And he reflects on that and reflects on that. And finally, then he gives this answer in the second inaugural. The war will go on until the scales are even, until all the back wages of 250 years of slavery, that amount of money shall be equaled by an amount of white property damage, destruction. And until all the blood drawn by overseers and owners with their whips and scourges shall be compensated by an equal amount of blood shed by white soldiers, then and only then will the war end. Now, he's not saying that that's certain, but if it is certain, then we have to say with the psalmist of old, the ways of the Lord are righteous and just altogether. Well, it's truly a remarkable speech. And one of the things that I find most moving when I go to Washington, D.C., which I do a lot, is to go to the Lincoln Memorial. And you all probably know, when you're standing in front of the magnificent statue of the enthroned Lincoln, if you look to your right, on the wall you'll see the second inaugural address, and if you look to the left, you'll see the Gettysburg Address. And one of the things that I find most moving about going to the Lincoln Memorial is to observe parents with little children reading the second inaugural. The parents read it to the kids as though this is a very important document, which it is. And I'm very touched by the fact that this document being read by parents to children is regarded so highly. It's not a self-congratulatory Arc de Triomphe sort of sentiment, indeed. And I think it speaks very highly for Abraham Lincoln that he uttered it, and it speaks very highly for the American people that they regard it as such an important document. Well, I'd like to close my formal remarks by just reading to you a couple of chapters. The final paragraph. I'm going to save you 1,600 pages of reading here. You still have to buy it. Right. And this sums up my own feeling about the inspirational aspects of Lincoln's life story. Lincoln speaks to us not only as a champion of freedom and democracy and national unity, but also as a source of inspiration. Few people will achieve his world historical importance, but many can profit from his example. Encouraged by the knowledge that despite a childhood of emotional malnutrition and grinding poverty, despite a lack of formal education, despite a series of career failures, despite a miserable marriage, despite a tendency to depression, despite a painful midlife crisis, despite the early death of his mother and his 2 siblings, as well as of his sweetheart and 2 of his 4 children, Abraham Lincoln became a model of psychological maturity, moral clarity, and unimpeachable integrity. His presence and his leadership inspired his contemporaries. His life story can do the same for generations to come. I thank you for your attention. Now, I promised that I would be happy to try to respond to questions or comments, and so fire away. Yes, sir.
This was cut out of the paper during the Civil War.
Uh-huh.
And it's a big article, and it's all the things that Lincoln said. He invited all the representatives, something you mentioned just a short while back, of the border states, and he was trying to get them to go to the Union. And it tells how many slaves was in each state,
Yep.
and they were gonna pay them $300
Right.
apiece
Right.
for the slaves.
Right.
And land was cheap in South America. They was gonna send them there and colonize South America. I was amazed when I read that in here.
Well, the colonization story is a significant one. Lincoln is often criticized by modern commentators for having recommended colonization as a part of the package that he put forward of compensated gradual emancipation. And colonization meant that freed slaves would be encouraged, not forced, but encouraged to leave the country, to be repatriated to Africa or to go to Latin America, to Panama or Haiti or elsewhere. Some folks have said that this indicates that Lincoln really wasn't very committed to racial justice, that he really didn't care much about black people and the injustice of slavery. And that, I think, is a fundamental misreading of the colonization proposal. The colonization proposal was designed, I believe, primarily to sugarcoat the pill of emancipation. That many Northerners, well, first of all the slaveholders in the border states, that is Kentucky, Maryland, Delaware, and Missouri, were not going to be happy about emancipation, even if they were compensated, because they didn't. Then what's going to happen to these black people? Are they going to live in our midst? How are we going to get along with them? It's unthinkable. And so Lincoln realized that that objection had to be addressed, and if emancipation could be coupled with colonization, then it would be a lot more palatable to those slaveholders in the border states, and also to a lot of conservatives and moderates in the lower north, that is in the states that bordered the South, that is New Jersey, Pennsylvania, Ohio, Indiana, Illinois. And there was a lot of very conservative sentiment in those areas. And they were fearful that blacks would, once they were freed, would come spilling over the Ohio River or the Mason-Dixon line, and they didn't want them in their midst. And Lincoln was told this by representatives from these states. The only way my voters back home are going to be happy with emancipation is if you couple it with colonization. So Lincoln, I'm pretty sure, didn't really believe that this was a practical measure, but that it would help grease the skids for emancipation. And he knew that when he issued this Emancipation Proclamation, there was going to be a strong white backlash. That an awful lot of white people in the North, particularly the lower North and the border states, said, we will fight and die to preserve the Union, but we will be damned if we're going to go fight to abolish slavery. And so Lincoln had to soft pedal the moral aspect of emancipation and make it a practical issue. And so the Emancipation Proclamation is actually a pretty disappointing document in its language, very significant in its import, but the language is very flat and legalistic. And that's because Lincoln emphasized that this was a practical war measure. This was going to undermine the capacity of the South to wage war, and therefore you should support it. If you're for winning the war to preserve the Union, you should be for emancipation because it will help speed the victory of the North. Now, and this business about how Lincoln was unsympathetic to black rights should be rethought, particularly in light of the fact that when Lincoln gave that April 11th speech that I alluded to and that Frederick Douglass alluded to, Douglass said that he didn't, and many of his abolitionist friends, didn't fully appreciate its significance. But there was one member of the audience who did appreciate its significance. That was a charismatic young actor named John Wilkes Booth. And when he heard Lincoln call for black voting rights, limited to be sure, he turned to his companions and said, that means nigger citizenship. That's the last speech he's ever going to give. By God, I'm going to run him through. And 3 days later, he shot Lincoln. Not because Lincoln issued the Emancipation Proclamation, not because he supported the 13th Amendment, but because he called for black citizenship rights. And therefore, we should regard Abraham Lincoln as a martyr to black citizenship rights just as much as Martin Luther King or Medgar Evers or Viola Liuzzo or James Reeb or James Chaney or Mickey Schwerner or Andrew Goodman, any of those people who were killed in the 1960s as civil rights activists. And so to say Lincoln didn't care about black citizenship rights and the like, in light of the fact that he got killed for endorsing them, seems to me to be grossly unfair. On the back, I thought I saw, yes, ma'am. This lady first and then you, sir.
When you're endeavoring to start a new publication about Lincoln, you've written so much already.
Right.
It has been so much written. How do you know where to go to get new research material? Like people, if you say, oh, I think there's something really good here.
Well, my friends say that I'm like a water witcher, like an idiot savant. I go into a library and I just have a kind of sixth sense for where there's new stuff. It's mostly in unpublished manuscript material, but also in newspapers. The two main sources of new information that I've dug up are in manuscript collections and newspapers. Now, when people read about Lincoln's presidency, they used newspapers because newspapers were important. They told you what the president was doing. And they almost always go to New York newspapers on the very understandable assumption that New York papers had the biggest budgets and therefore the biggest staffs of Washington correspondents and therefore the most comprehensive coverage. And that's true. But if you were a Vermont congressman or a Vermont general or a Vermont senator and you went to the White House, spoke with the president, you came out, did you go to somebody to tell about your experience with the president? Did you go to the New York Herald or the New York Times, the New York Post, the New York Tribune? No. You went to the Burlington Free Press where there was a journalist that you knew and liked and wanted to give him a story. So you've got to go through all kinds of newspapers in order to dig up new information about Lincoln. And it's tedious work. You've got to sit in front of a microfilm reader and you just turn the crank and turn the crank and turn the crank and you read the Washington Correspondence every day. And if you do it, you find a lot of new material. And sometimes I feel as though my career has described a parabola. When I was a sophomore in college, David Donald had me sit in front of a microfilm reader and turn the crank and look at the New York Herald looking for references to Charles Sumner. And now I sit in front of a microfilm reader and turn the crank and look for references to Abraham Lincoln. But if you do that, you find an awful lot of good new information. But it's tedious work. And then manuscript collections. Now, manuscript collections are the collections of letters, incoming mail, drafts of outgoing mail, drafts of speeches, diaries, scrapbooks, all kinds of stuff. And there are high concentrations of Lincoln-related material at the Library of Congress, where I've spent so much time, I'm afraid they're going to charge me rent, and a great deal of information in Springfield, Illinois, where I've also spent a great deal of time. In fact, a little newspaper there did a story on me once saying, believe it or not, there's somebody who spends the summer in Springfield voluntarily. And I explained that, well, I used to spend my summers in Washington, D.C., but the problem with the nation's capital, for me anyhow, is that it's not hot and humid enough, so I go to Springfield. But in any event, but when you deal with the Lincoln presidency, you've really got to go all around the country. Because if Lincoln speaks to a Vermont congressman, senator, or general, that gentleman writes back to his wife or to his law partner or to his political campaign manager or whoever, a neighbor, and then those letters will oftentimes get left to the local historical society or the state historical society or the University of Vermont. And so you really have to go to Maine, Vermont, New Hampshire, and so on, all around from Kentucky to Iowa to Michigan to Virginia. And that's somewhat tedious work. You have to be on the road a lot. You're away from home. It's lonely and it can be expensive. And that kind of road work is usually done by young historians before they get married and have children and mortgages and all that. And then by the time that the kids are out of the house, then they're usually tired, don't want to do this. But I have a maladjusted thyroid gland, and I just love doing that sort of thing. And my better half to be puts up with it. And it turns out actually, it's the only thing that can get her blood pressure down is for me to go away for a few weeks on a research trip. So those are the main sources. And there are certain manuscript collections that have been gone over and over and over again, but a lot of others that have been neglected. And it's tedious because to find letters, it's easy to find the letters that Lincoln wrote. Those are all published. It's easy to find the letters that he received, most of them. They're at the Library of Congress in the Lincoln papers. What's really hard to find is letters about Lincoln. And you just have to go through dozens and dozens of letters before you find one that alludes to a conversation somebody had with Lincoln or a comment on Lincoln administration policies or what the president looks like or his health or any of that sort of thing. And again, it's tedious work. You just have to, there's a lot of gravel you have to sift before you find gold nuggets. But if you do, you can find quite a bit. But I've found a lot of new evidence in newspaper articles that he wrote anonymously for the local paper in Springfield in his 20s and his 30s. His law partner said that he and Lincoln used to write all the time for the paper, and nobody that I know of has ever tried to systematically identify those pieces. Well, I've done it, and I found over 200 that I'm pretty sure are by Lincoln. And these are really low-road political rhetoric. These are op-ed pieces that ridicule and humiliate Democrats. It's a lot of personal attacks on not only on the principles of his opponents, but on their appearance and political histories. And it's pretty unsavory stuff. And he even engages in race baiting. In 1836, when he's 27 years old, and in 1840, when he's 30 years old, he urges everybody through these anonymous and pseudonymous newspaper articles to vote against Martin Van Buren, the Democratic candidate for president. Because Martin Van Buren had supported black suffrage, or limited black suffrage at the New York State Constitutional Convention of 1821. That was a standard Whig argument, by the way. Lincoln didn't invent it. And the Democrats accused the Whigs of being soft on race and slavery, too. So the race baiting was common on both sides. But Lincoln really emphasized this pretty heavily. Even writing a letter in black dialect in which he pretends he's a black person writing to another black person saying, we all got to support Van Buren and he'll really help us out. So he's a pretty low-road politician in his 20s and 30s. And then he's a very high-road politician in his 40s and his 50s. And between those two periods, there's a 5-year gap when he drops out of politics for all intents and purposes. He doesn't run for office. He hardly speaks in political campaigns, a little bit, dabbles, but not much at all. And in those 5 years, between the age of 40 and 45, he goes through a tremendous period of growth, from the small-bore, low-road politician to the great statesman. Because all the statesman-like qualities we see in Lincoln as president, we see in him from 1854 to 1861 when he was leading the anti-slavery cause in Illinois and founding the Republican Party, getting it to get the factions to cooperate with each other, giving great speeches. And so one of the striking things about Lincoln is this growth, and that it takes place in these 5 years. And I think it's a dramatic example of a successful midlife crisis. The midlife crisis is often caricatured as men running off with their secretaries in red sports cars. Well, that does happen now and then, but the midlife transition is a very important period in many men's lives. Modern psychological studies that I'm familiar with suggest that many men, the majority of men, who go through their early 40s engage in a kind of introspection, asking themselves, did I make the right career choice? Did I make the right marital choice? Have I suppressed elements of my personality and character in order to please the collective? What do I want to leave as a legacy? What's truly important and what's unimportant? And that questioning is usually precipitated by the knowledge that you've probably lived already longer than you're going to live. You have fewer years left than you've already spent, and how do you want to spend them? And out of this introspection can come depression, brooding, but it can also, out of that can come tremendous psychological growth. Out of it can come stasis, and out of it can come crashing and burning too. And it's hard to say why some people grow in that period and others don't. But Lincoln, it seems to me, is one of the most dramatic examples of somebody who went through a highly successful midlife crisis. And the story of how he grew that dramatically, I think, can be inspirational. Yes, sir.
This is the third one of these talks I've been to, and I also saw a 2-hour, very in-depth documentary on Lincoln on, I guess it was public television.
Yeah.
And yet, all these discussions, I've never once even heard of the role that Horace Greeley played with Lincoln ever even mentioned. And that
Right.
surprises me a little
Right.
bit, because there was at least up to a dozen letters exchanged
Right.
between Lincoln and Greeley
Right.
in the summer of 1862, and nobody
Yep.
ever even
Right.
mentioned it, so
Right.
somebody's missing a hole here.
Well, there's a very famous, Horace Greeley was the editor of the New York Tribune, which was the newspaper of record in those days. Right, and he was the proprietor, the founder, the editor, and he was the most influential journalist in the country. It was the newspaper of record. It's what the New York Times is today. And it was a national newspaper. There were semi-weekly and weekly editions that went all over the country. And Greeley represented an important constituency, his readers. And so Lincoln cultivated him. And one of the most famous letters, public letters, that Lincoln wrote was a letter to Horace Greeley in August of 1862. Greeley pleaded with Lincoln in a famous editorial called The Prayer of 20 Millions to emancipate the slaves. And Lincoln wrote back a public letter to him. And this was a technique that Lincoln started to use with this letter. And then he used it on several other occasions later in the war. Lincoln didn't go around the country giving speeches, but he did write public letters that were widely circulated in newspapers and in pamphlet form. And in those, they were the equivalent of press conferences and speeches. And in this letter to Horace Greeley, he addresses the question of slavery. And this is August 22nd, 1862. He's already written the Emancipation Proclamation. It's sitting in his drawer. He's looking for an opportunity to issue it. When he told his cabinet on July 22nd, 1862, that he was going to issue the Emancipation Proclamation, his cabinet said, quite rightly, Mr. President, we've just lost a major military campaign. If we issue an Emancipation Proclamation in its immediate wake, it will look like a desperation measure rather than a sincere gesture. So let's wait till we have a victory. So Lincoln was waiting for a victory. And then Greeley urges him to issue an Emancipation Proclamation. And Lincoln then writes this letter to Greeley in which he says, what I do with regard to slavery and the colored race, I do because of its bearing on saving the Union. If I could best save the Union by freeing all the slaves, I would do that. If I could best save the Union by freeing none of the slaves, I would do that. If I could best save the Union by freeing some of the slaves and leaving others in bondage, which is, of course, what the Emancipation Proclamation did, I would do that. And what Lincoln was doing in this letter is often misinterpreted as Lincoln's profound, innermost feelings about the slavery and race issues. In fact, it's a public document designed to grease the skids for the Emancipation Proclamation. Just as colonization was designed to reduce white backlash, so too was this letter. And saying, in effect, when I do issue an Emancipation Proclamation, it will be because it's going to help to win the war. And all of you folks out there who say you'll fight to save the Union but won't fight to free the slaves should recognize that freeing the slaves helps us to win the war. It's a means to achieve an end that we both agree upon. But then he says at the end of that letter, nothing in this letter should be construed as in any way altering my oft expressed wish that every man everywhere should be free. So it's a good point. Greeley was an important figure. Yes, sir?
I wonder what your appraisal is of the recent medical history of Lincoln called the physical Lincoln, which suggests that he may have been suffering from cancer.
There's a book that's recently come out by a physician which argues that Lincoln may have been suffering from cancer. I've not read that book. It was sent to me by the author, and it's on my. It's one of the books that I've got to read. But most of the time when doctors write about Lincoln, you wonder how these guys ever got into medical school, because they don't use historical evidence and historical logic in a way that is second nature to a trained historian. By the same token, when historians write about medical conditions with Lincoln, they don't know anything about medicine. So it's pretty unsatisfactory literature. The most controversial subject that I'm aware of in that area is the question of whether Lincoln had Marfan's syndrome, which is a disease that leads to folks having elongated limbs and elongated fingers and elongated hearts. Big feet, and Lincoln's unusual appearance. He was 6'4", which by modern standards would be like 6'8" or 6'9". He had very long limbs, very big feet, and the like. And there's the doctors who wrote about it didn't use evidence very well and sources very well, and the historians who wrote about it didn't use medicine very well, didn't know much medicine. But a team of brothers, one a physician and one a trained historian, looked at the evidence and concluded that in all likelihood he did not have Marfan syndrome because he was still very strong as president. And usually by the time patients with Marfan syndrome reach their 50s, if they live that long, then they're physically weak, partly because the heart just is misshapen and doesn't function as well as it should and doesn't pump blood as readily as is necessary to maintain strength. I see in the back somebody standing up. Should we call it a day?
Well, thank you. Thank you all for coming.